Hey, good evening. Welcome to Wednesday Night in the Word. We're glad you're with us. Trust that you're going to have a great evening. And got a crowd here tonight, and so we're going to go with it here. So if my iPad's kind of off center a little bit, off to the right. So anyway, we're going to get in the Word and see what we can look into. We're started out last week. We were in Hebrews chapter 12, and we are probably going to go back there. Some of this I can't seem to get out of my system for whatever reason, and there's just so much of it that in all the comparisons and contrast between the old and new covenant and law and grace and those kind of things, it's just the scripture is so rich with those comparisons and contrasts that you don't always get everything said. At least I'll say I don't always get everything said to my own satisfaction. And so this just really settled in on me. I couldn't shake it this morning as I was looking to see how what direction to pursue tonight. But we're glad you're here, and we're going to start. It's going to sound a lot like last week. Last week we talked about yet once more, and this week I'm going to call this glory to glory. But it's going to be very similar in a lot of ways. And sometimes I think when we begin to emphasize the new covenant kingdom age and relationship with God, that we tend to, of course, it moves us away from the letter of the law and the law of Moses. It moves us out of the dominion of that paradigm, if you will. But we also need to understand that work and that covenant and that operation of how God connected and related to the world early on was very beneficial in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways, we are beneficiaries of that system and that system playing out, I'll say. Anyway, so let's look at this for a minute, and I'm going to start again, Hebrews chapter 12. I'm going to start with verse 22. And again, this is a classic. I'm starting on the back end of this because if I started earlier, we'd be talking about the mountain we didn't come to, the mountain that burned with fire, Mount Sinai, when the giving of the law where the whole mountain was smoke and fire and trembled, and the earth shook, and the earth was so affected by the dynamic of God speaking to men. Okay. And it's a powerful thing, and I don't want to undersell that, and I think we're going to deal with some of that tonight. But what I also want us to see is that for the great glory that existed in that, God has now called us to a greater glory. A glory that exceeds the former glory. And so we're going to be looking at some of those things tonight. Hopefully we'll get through this. So I'm going to start with where we are, and it says, "But you are come unto Mount Zion." You're not come to the mountain that couldn't be touched, where Moses himself said he exceedingly was fearful and that he quaked. He himself was absolutely almost astonished by the power and the presence of God in that moment. And there's just an incredible thing, we're going to get to it here in my estimation, that I think we need to pay some attention to and kind of at least tip the hat of homage and respect toward. But anyway, that's not the mountain you and I have come to. We've come unto Mount Zion, verse 22, and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to an innumerable company of angels. Verse 23, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, which are written in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect, Verse 24, and to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. See that you refuse not him that speaketh. For if they escape not who refused him that spake on earth, much more shall not we escape if we turn away from him that speaks from heaven. Whose voice then shook the earth, but now he hath promised, saying, yet once more I shake not the earth only, but also heaven. 27, and this word yet once more signifies the removing of those things that are shaken, as of things that are made, and that those things which cannot be shaken may remain. Verse 28, wherefore we, receiving a kingdom which cannot be moved, let us have grace, whereby we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. I'm going to stop there, but it finishes the chapter with, for our God is a consuming fire. Now, what I want to, last week we talked about God speaking once more, and we talked about the two earthquakes. We talked about the shaking. We talked about the earthquake when Jesus died, and we talked about the earthquake when he rose. And one of the things that just kept working on me this week was that the voice of God, how the voice of God shook everything. And so on Mount Sinai, you have this powerful atmospheric manifestation of the presence of God and the glory of God and the power of God. And it was so intimidating, and it was so heavy, and so just kind of caused the people to back up, right? Kind of caused the people to crawl beneath the mountain, if you will, crawl and find an enclave or some kind of ledge to hide under, right? And so there was this overwhelming picture that's presented there. And I was thinking about that earlier this morning, and thinking about how, the significance of all that, because God had liberated them. This was 50 days after Passover. And he had brought them out through the sea, and he delivered them from Egyptian bondage, and he'd brought them through the Red Sea, into the desert of Sinai. And as they were there, they stood, and here's a people that had, for all intents and purposes, had lost their true sense of themselves. Okay, they willfully and voluntarily went to Egypt to survive a famine. And when they went there, they stayed. And so they became affected. They became very influenced, if you will, by Egyptian philosophy, Egyptian religion, Egyptian culture. And so they just kind of assimilated even after, because the famine lasted 7 years, right? And so they stayed even after the famine was over. They stayed and continued in Egypt, and they were content to stay there. But God had promised Abraham real estate for a possession. And they weren't in any big hurry to see that manifestation. They had perhaps even had forgotten about the mandate that God had given Abraham. And so they were content to live among the Egyptians and be another group of people in a cultural environment that was not built for them. And so then what happens is a Pharaoh arises who doesn't remember Joseph. And so he begins to resent their presence, and he begins to put them to work and bring them to task, and begins to cause them to enter into a bondage, an element of they're not there because they want to be there. Now they're there because it's mandated from Pharaoh to be there. And so all that they were before they went in to survive a 7-year famine, all that they were before that, they have, I won't say they have lost it. I'm going to say they don't realize it. It's lost to them. It's not lost to God. It's not lost to his purpose, his plan. And so he allows some things to begin to work, to move them, to make them uncomfortable, to get them to cry to move, to want to be something other than strangers and slaves in a strange land. And so there's this powerful working, a master working, if you will, behind the scenes to produce a groan or a cry for deliverance, for a deliverer. And as you know, we know that story well. God raises up Moses, and we all know that story real well. So I'm going to move through this and bring us to this moment where they're at the mountain. They have been liberated. The Passover lamb's been slain. They've left Egypt with a high hand. They have walked out and they've been challenged at the Red Sea. As we would say, they've been caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. Well, it would be Pharaoh and the Red Sea in their instance. That would be not even their metaphor. That would be their literal position, right? Anyway, what happens is God makes a way where there is no way. God shows himself to be sovereign. He shows himself to be mighty. He shows himself to them with such a display of power, even though they'd seen power in all of the plagues and in all of those 10 manifestations that finally broke the bonds of the fetters of Egyptian slavery and released them to serve God and to find him and to follow him. They find a new way to celebrate, a new way to appreciate who he is and what he's done at the shores of the Red Sea. And they go to Mount Sinai, and as they are there and God starts to show them, he starts to build something. He starts to put something together. And he's starting to bring the formation, if you will, of Egyptian of Jewish culture. Let me get this right. It's the sound of his voice shook the earth. And so it's the sound. Let's look at verse 25 and in Hebrews. So let me get back to this. I'm going to bounce back and forth here. So what he's doing, the writer of Hebrews, is he's comparing the mediation of Christ and the blood of sprinkling that he offered, and how the sound of that is better, how the voice of what God says to us in his Son is superior. It is better. It exceeds the glory of the first covenant, okay? And it's important to appreciate the power of the first covenant, because God says what I'm doing is better than that. It's bigger than that. It's more powerful. It's more direct. It's greater than what you have known, and what you've known's been pretty good. Okay? But he says, see that you refuse not him that speaketh. And that Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, in verse 24, and the blood of sprinkling, which speaks better things than that of Abel. See that you refuse not him that speak. What are we talking about? Don't refuse. Make sure you pay close attention. Make sure you listen closely, or be attentive to what the mediation of Jesus brings to the table for us, what he has to say and speak into our lives, because he is promoting us, he is advancing us into a better covenant, established on better promises and a more excellent ministry. We are finding our way forward in such a powerful way that now what's been in the past, as good as that's been, and we're going to talk about how good it's been, as good as that's been, Jesus is speaking better things. what he's offering to the world is a better deal. It is a greater salvation. It is more complete. It's truer and more direct to the problem and to the point of our sinfulness, if you will. So it's important that we look at some of this and just really kind of walk through it just for a few minutes and see that you refuse not him that speaketh. I love that. Don't refuse him. And so, well, I thought about that, and I thought, wonder what that word means. And I looked it up, and it's the same word used when Jesus teaches the parable in Luke 14 about the man that makes a great supper, right? And he says they begin to make excuse for themselves as to why they couldn't come. So what are they doing? They're refusing him that speaks, right? They are brushing aside. They are, disinterested, not willing to listen, not willing to pay attention. What they're doing, and see, that is so powerful to me, because Jesus taught that parable as a way to say to his Jewish compatriots that God's saying something very important here. In the feast that he's made for his son, he's saying something very important, but you're so busy with your letters and your law, and you're so busy with your own dynamic of how you're serving this and how you're doing this, that you're not hearing what God has to say. And you are pulling yourself out of the conversation. You are refusing or making an excuse as to why. Well, one says, I've got a new set of oxen. I've got to prove them. I bought a field. I have to go look at it. I've married a wife, and I can't leave her alone for a while. And so you've got all of these, these legal excuses that gives you a pass in the law, that now he says in this feast you can't use that kind of an excuse to not comply, to not lean in, to not participate, to not allow yourself to be blessed by this feast. So this is why, so the writer here is saying, see that you refuse not him that speaketh. And so this is a very important thing to think about, because as Jesus taught these parables, he was being, in most cases, he was being very direct to his generation. And he was saying to them, listen, you guys, if you don't open your heart to what God is saying to you through his son, then you are going to miss it, and you're going to suffer the consequences. But guess whose feast is going to have people there? If it's not you, God will open the door. God will bring in, he'll go to the highways and the hedges. I'm not having this. This feast is going to be well attended. It may not be attended by the people I invited first, but it's going to be well attended. And so when you think about this and you start to look at it, and you think about the wedding feast and how the way that it's presented to us, that they go out and they give wedding garments out, and they bring all these people from the highways and the hedges, and they call in people, and he says, there's room, go compel them to come in, right? And then he comes by and he says to one particular person, you don't have a wedding garment in. How'd you get in here? And so I was thinking about that earlier today, and I was thinking about that how the dynamic of the new covenant starts to work. And remember, Jesus said that the new covenant's like a great net that God casts into the sea, and he gathers fish of every kind. And what kind is that? There's two kinds of fish, good and bad. And what happens is we just think we're getting the good ones. We think we only want the good ones, and we don't know how to call that. Well, it's not our job to call it. You have to let God do that. That's kind of his prerogative, if you will. But I'll give you an example. The net of the kingdom got cast into Jerusalem, and it started to draw all kinds of people. If I can say it to you this way, the people who wouldn't come when this feast of his son was first manifest on the day of Pentecost, which coincides with this thing we're talking about, this mountain of Sinai. That's where Pentecost is, the feast of the giving of the law, okay? And it coincides with the wheat harvest. So think about this for a minute. That first mountain, where it burned with fire and with smoke and with darkness, and it quaked, and it brought fear and trembling, and 3,000 people perished on the real day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. There was a whole different manifestation, but can I interest you? There was a sound. There came a sound from heaven. There was something. See, there was a sound and fury on Mount Sinai at the first Pentecost, but on this one, there came a sound from heaven, like a groaning spirit, like a rushing mighty wind. And when that started working, and that sound was made, it was not a sound that brought fear. It was a sound that drew men together. It was not a sound that made people scatter and try to find hiding places. It was a sound that pulled them into the feast, right? It pulled them in to the feast of the Son of God, because the marriage of the Lamb, they were standing there looking at it. And it starts to draw in of every kind. And we just think it got all the good ones. But there's a story later about a couple named Ananias and Sapphira that got called out. Why is that? Because they were some of the bad fish, okay? The kingdom net drew them in, right? And they started to try to figure out how we can work the kingdom to our advantage, rather than how can we give ourselves to the kingdom to advance the kingdom, and that will be advantage enough for us. Anyway, so there was just so much of this that started just kind of knocking on my front door this morning. It was hard to settle down. In fact, I didn't come up with a title for this till about 4-something today. And it just kept working all the time I was cutting grass. It just kept working me over pretty good. But he tells us that we need to refuse not him that speaks. We can't make excuse. We can't just kind of excuse ourselves from what God's saying to us in his Son. He goes, verse 26, he says, whose voice then shook the earth. So what's he doing? He's reaching back to that other mountain, in my estimation. And so what's happening here? So if we go back and we look at this, like I said, Israel had, for all intents and purposes, had lost all sense of themselves. God hadn't lost his plan. God's purpose was not misplaced. God was not wringing his hands in the heavens, wondering what to do. God said, I've got a plan for the descendants of Abraham. I need to pull them in. And so I'm going to start working. Even when they can't see it, I'm working, right? And so he starts to move them a little bit, leverage them a little bit, if you will. And so while he may not be the author of all that they suffered, he certainly used their suffering to get their attention and to gain their trust, okay? So, anyway, whose voice then shook the earth. So God was shaking the earth. And so now what God was saying is I'm going to change some things of this historic voice. Because what he does here is this is the formation of Jewish culture is set in motion on this mountain. They start to redefine what it means to be Hebrew, to be Israel, to be Jewish. They start to find their way forward. And so there's a formation of Jewish culture set in motion. It is the template. It is a pattern, if you will, for social construction or for the building of. And if I can say it to you this way, I know that it is inherently Jewish, and we look at it and we say, okay, that belongs to them. But nations and cultures have dipped into the wisdom and the template and the formation of the. And so what that did is, you think about the magnitude of effect that moment had. We are back. So It looks like we got reset. So I believe we're up and running. So the magnitude of effect from that moment on Mount Sinai is it shook the earth, and it has spanned the globe, right, for influence and effect. And that's a powerful thing. And so I don't want to, sometimes it's like we minimize or demean what existed before us, and I'm not interested in trying to put myself under the dominion of that, but I do believe that it is worthy of respect and honor that what has done. I certainly do not want to despise on any level. But that glory that belongs to that moment that shook the earth, and that was when God spoke. It was an earth-shaking thing on a human, and I'm going to say this, on a human evolutionary scale. And when I say that, makes some folks uncomfortable. I believe in human evolution. I do not believe in Darwinism. Evolution just means slow change, okay? And so in the truest sense of the word and definition of the word, I believe that human beings change slowly over a period of time. Culture shifts and changes. In other words, some of the things, you rarely hear anybody say that somebody's big enough to go bear hunting with a buggy switch anymore. And why is that? Well, because our culture has shifted and changed, and nobody uses buggy switches anymore. And most of us don't even know what a buggy switch is. That being said, that's why I mean that's part of what I mean when I talk about human evolution. I'm talking about how we change as a people, as a culture, as a nation, and even as individuals. We change over a long period of time. It's not a flash in the pan type thing. Thank you, Ruth. I appreciate it. And I always like to differentiate between, because most of the time if you use the word evolution, you lose people and they think you're talking about Darwinism, and that's not necessarily what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about us coming from monkeys. I'm talking about us changing gradually, okay? That's what I'm talking about. So anyway, but you think about this, that other than they were coming into a realm and into a uniqueness, a unique state of being, into their own state, if you will. And there were other cultures and there were other frameworks. They came out of one. Egypt was very civilized and very established, we'll say. That being said, we look at some of this stuff and nothing has stood the test of time like what happened when this voice spoke on Sinai and shook the earth, okay? So, and I know that in academia, they'll kind of, they're eager to point out that the Code of Hammurabi predates the law of Moses, and that Chinese philosophy predates the law of Moses. And I'm not going to argue those particular points. But what I will say is that the Code of Hammurabi was written in signs and symbols, and we're still trying to decode it, so it hasn't done us a whole lot of good. And that Chinese philosophy, for better or worse, was so isolated and so walled off to the interior and cordoned off by the Great Sea that it didn't have a great influence abroad for a long period of time. Not like this word, not like this moment, not like this people, okay? And so, I'm not looking to fight with anybody over this. I'm just saying that what happened here advanced. This stuff is the cornerstone of which Western civilization as we know it is built on it, okay? And not only Western civilization, but most modern civilization is built on the principles of that structure, of that formation. And whether people like it or don't like it, or whether they want to admit it or not admit it, is that's their, I guess that's their prerogative, but it doesn't make it any less true. And for the folks, there's folks out there that believe that you can, that you don't need God to be moral. Well, you may not now, but you did, because you wouldn't know what morals was without it. If God hadn't spoke and said and defined right and wrong, if God hadn't had put it in this kind of a presentation, if you will, to the world to show us how to build the kind of community that's worth living in, right? If he hadn't have done this, then we would still be floundering. It's hard to tell what we would look like, but we wouldn't look like we do today. Anyway, so let's move on. And then preach my Kindle Dark. Imagine that. And I'll get it back up here, and it says, whose voice then shook the earth. It says, but now he's promised. See, God did all this to set mankind in a position to hear what he had to say that was better. If I can submit that to you. I said all of that to say this. Through this line of teaching, through this codification, the writing of law that could be understood, and if you were illiterate, you had somebody who was literate who could read it and explain it to you, okay? And so that helps to some degree. And so the degree of literacy that's transpired over the last several hundred years has been a phenomenal thing, and has been one of those things that has caused us to advance to the position we're in now. So anyway, but God spoke, and he did that, and he set that because he had a word for the world. And that word was not going to just shake the earth, it was going to shake heaven also. It was the word of his Son. It was the word made flesh. It was the message of God's great love. And he commended his love toward us. And while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And so God says to the world, I want to put you in a stable position. I want to bring you to a position where you can exist in a stable enough format that I can speak to you and advance you, that I can show you something and move you forward, that I can bring you, I can call you, I can draw you to myself. And so what goes into this is that thank God for that mountain. Thank God for what he established. But now thank God that he's brought us to a new mountain, right? Thank God that we're not going back to this, that we're moving from this, we're moving forward. From this, we've leaped to another mountaintop. We have stood at the pinnacle of Zion. And now we are not looking at old Jerusalem. We're looking at a heavenly Jerusalem. We're not looking at an earthly structure of a temple. We're looking at the church of the firstborn. We're looking at an innumerable company of angels. We're not looking at all kinds of pans and platters and priestly vestments and the apparatus of a animal sacrificial system. We're looking now at the movement of heavenly things. We are now invested and brought into the realm of heaven itself. By the blood of the Son of God, by the mediation of Jesus, by the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things, that says it's not about revenge anymore. We've laid that to rest. Now I'm calling you to reconciliation. I'm calling you to redemption. I'm calling you to be restored, renewed. Hallelujah. And so he says, Don't refuse him that speaks, because now what we've got is that voice spoke and shook the earth, but now he's promised to shake the heavens. Now we're shaking everything. Why is that? Because we're not talking about a covenant that's literally limited to humanity. We're talking about a covenant now that is kingdom. We're talking about a new covenant that opens the door of the kingdom to us. That's what John started to introduce to us, right? He started to say, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Change the way you think. You have to shift the way you think to find the door to the kingdom. You have to shift the way you think to be able to enter into the kingdom. You can't think by letter of the law. This is what caused the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and the lawyers and the doctors and the chief priests and rulers. They were so entangled, if you will, in the machinery and the network of the law that they couldn't see anything other than that apparatus. And Jesus came to show us. He came to lift us up. He came to say, I'm not, the law was really to show you who I am. And now, and I want you to see who I am, because when you see who I am, then you see who you can be. Well, I've had this crazy thought the last several weeks that's really started working on me. And that is, when God created the world in Genesis, he made man in his image and in his likeness. And yet, God was invisible, and we knew not what that image and likeness actually meant until Jesus came, who is the express image of the invisible God, right? Jesus came and he brought substance to the idea of being made in the image of God. So what does that say? It says that he has promoted us. He's advanced us. He has raised us up into a better position, an exceedingly a superior posture or position, not to be condescending and to be arrogant or haughty, but that we're in a better place, right? Now, we say that all the time when people die. But what if I told you that you're in a better place today? How about that? That's pretty good news. That's the message of the gospel. You and I are in a better place without visiting the undertaker. Not that in itself is a bad thing. I'm just saying that we only think of it in particular directions, and God's calling us to start to shift the way we think about some things. And so when John makes that statement, Jesus comes right on the road he's prepared and says the same thing, right? Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Start thinking in the kingdom. Start letting your mind work in the kingdom. And you look at some of this and you think, well, you don't teach calculus to a first grader. And I get that. You don't. But as that first grader develops and grows, when he or she becomes capable of higher mathematics, then if they can do it, and that's kind of how the progression of the kingdom operates to me. You start to think in higher ways. You start to think in a more detailed capacity, if you will. How is it Isaiah said it? Isaiah prophesied and said, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are my ways your ways." And so we're content to quote that and stop there. But Isaiah goes on to say, "For as the rain and the snow comes down from heaven and does not return thither, it doesn't come emptily, then so will my word be that goes forth out of my mouth." So what's he saying? My thoughts and my ways that are higher than you right now, I'm going to cause them to distill in the heavens and come to the earth. And I'm going to cause them to bring life. I'm going to cause them to nurture. I'm going to cause them to replenish, cause them to bring life and grace and increase the capacity for growth in the earth, so that we can learn and know his ways, so that we can begin to consider his thoughts, right? Because Paul goes on to say, we have the mind of Christ. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God. Excuse me. But made himself of no reputation, and being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. So you have this, there's this marvelous paradox between these two things. And we see the first mountain for all that it was presented to us, and how that in that first mountain there were 3,000 people who perished because of the great shaking and the great the move of the powerful presence of God brought 3,000 people. 3,000 people died. Well, on Pentecost in Acts 2, when the noise from heaven comes and heaven itself is shaken yet once more, we've got heaven on the rise. We've got something now moving. And where these folks went and stood under a mountain, the pillar of fire breaks up and sets upon the heads of each of them. So we're looking at a canopy of fire. Hey, a flame of glory that has seated. He makes his angels spirits and his ministers a flame of fire, right? And what happens? 3,000 people get saved. Amen. So there's the complete reversal. So there's that. Why is that? Because they started hearing the mediator, the blood of better things, right? They started to hear the sound and the voice of the blood of Jesus, who was mediating a better covenant. God's interested in bringing life and grace to the world. God's interested in bringing us to a place where we can find our way forward. I gotta cover some other ground here, but when we talked about that shaking, and we talked about it through the earthquakes, through the vehicle, the earthquakes last week. Now we're looking at it from just simply God moving the world into a new day, a new dimension of life and grace. And so let's go quickly to John chapter 1, verses 17 and 18, because this kind of works alongside of what I just said about the image of God. At least for me it does. I'll see how well we do it for you. John 1 and 17 says, "For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ." Yeah. Is it a contradiction? Yes, to some degree. Is it a comparison? Yes. Is it a contrast? Absolutely. God brought the law and the hammer fell, if you will, and people died, and it became the do this or else. Yep. Straighten up and fly right or else. And there's still an element of that works in the world. Okay? There's still an element of that works in the world. But Jesus came and he brought grace and truth. He starts to bring us progressively into what's the spirit of what Moses was saying. And so he says that if you will love your neighbor as you love yourself, or you love God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself, you're not going to break the commandments. You're not going to do the kind of things that injure and damage and hurt other people. Yeah. And so he brings us to a different dynamic, where it's not just a conformity to rule, but it is a realization in the spirit of man, in the heart of man, a change or a rebirth, a renewal of what is appropriate and right, what is God-like inside of us, what bears that likeness and that image. Because the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. No man has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him. See, he came to show us the fatherhood of God. He came to model right relationship. He came to show us what it's like to walk with God in a way that you can have peace, that you can be empowered to assist and to help and to enhance the lives of other people who are suffering or who are struggling, and you can be agents of the kingdom to ease the suffering of humanity. The image of God that he brings to the world is now what we need to see. It's the face of the Lamb. That if you are part of the old order, you want to hide from it, but it's a face-hiding order. What do I mean by that? Moses hid his face, right? What Moses gave us was cold and ironclad. I'm going to say it to you that way. Jesus brought the warmth of God and the life of God in the middle of that coldness to show us that it's not about, God's not just some cold, austere slave driver in the heavens, that he is a father who genuinely, it's his good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Right? So let's jump to 2 Corinthians chapter 3. I'm going to start with verse 3, read through verse 10, and I'm going to get you out of here tonight. God willing. Anyway, Paul says this. Says, for as much as you are manifestly declared to be the epistle of Christ ministered by us. So this letter to the Corinthians says to them, you're really the letter. You're really the letter of Christ that I've written. I'm giving you a letter to read, but you're really the letter. So that's a word made manifest, right? Jesus was the word made flesh. You and I are an epistle. A people epistle. Right? And so now what we're looking at is we're looking at a I think the term is rhema, where it's the word alive in the middle of you, right? It's not just the logos, something said, including the thought, which is God had a redemptive thing to say to the world, and he had a way to describe himself, and he had the thought he had to do that. He so well articulated it in the fleshly incarnation of his Son that doesn't need to be articulated again. But yet you and I now find that image and that likeness in us, and so now we start to reiterate and echo and speak once again of the goodness of God and the fatherhood of God and the mercy of God. And we live peacefully, we live righteously, we live, in the present world. And we live in a way that is designed to, encourage and promote others to want to live better and live well. For as much as you are manifestly declared to be the epistle of Christ ministered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in the fleshy tables of the heart. See, this covenant brings it into the heart, right? And that's what the prophet said. It's what Jeremiah said. I'll make a new covenant with you. And I'll write it on the tables of your heart and the tables of your mind, right? I'll write it, I'll put it in there. I'm not going to take you by the hand and lead you like I did coming out of Egypt, but I'm going to put it inside of you. I want it to be something that is deposited in your being, in your belly, in the midst of who you are, so that you take on the identity of that word. And when people look at your life and my life, that hopefully they start to read enough of it and see enough of it that they can find him in it.
Yeah, that's right.
So we are the epistles of Christ, not written with ink and not written on tables of stone, but by the Spirit of God on the fleshy tables of the heart. Verse 4, and such trust have we through Christ to Godward. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God. This is all God's work, right? And so we want to give him the glory. That's what Paul's saying here. Verse 6, who also has made us able ministers of the New Testament. Yeah. This is a new thing. Able ministers, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Verse 7, but if the ministration of death, written and engraved in stones, was glorious. That's the voice that then shook the world. We were just reading about that in, in Hebrews chapter 12, the mountain that burned with fire. Paul says if that administration that killed people was engraved in stones, if that was glorious, and he's not saying it wasn't, he's saying that it was. But he says if that's glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away. How shall not the ministration of the Spirit be rather glorious or more glorious or have a greater glory? So it's not so to acknowledge the glory of the old covenant or the glory of what happened on that mountain in days gone by, there's nothing wrong or nothing dangerous about that when you know what mountain you're on and you know what what covenant you belong to, and you know that the instrument of God is an instrument of the Spirit and not the letter. Excuse me. I did mow grass today. But if the ministration of condemnation be glory, how much more the ministration of righteousness exceed in glory? Now, Moses would cover his face. Remember this, he said, which glory was to be done away. There's another translation that talks about how that glory faded, and that Moses covered his face so that the children of Israel would not see that the glory was fading off of him. So that he could, this sounds like I'm making Moses disingenuous here, but he kept his face covered so that they wouldn't realize that this glory was destined to fade into the background. And why is that? Because God had a bigger plan all along. God had something else in mind all along. And so, it's a ministration of righteousness which exceeds the glory of the first one. Verse 10, and this is where we're going to quit tonight. For even that which was made glorious had no glory in this respect, by reason of the glory that excelleth. So when you compare the two, the glory of the latter house is greater than the glory of the former house. So see that you refuse not him that speaks. Let's not make excuses. Let's encourage ourselves and encourage one another to listen closely, to pay close attention, to be attentive to what the Word says and what the Spirit of God is saying. It's like I love the phrasing of the Gospels, and even in the book of Revelation where it says, "He that hath ears to hear, let him hear." And in the Gospels, it's "He that hath an ear to hear, let him hear." And in the book of Revelation, it's "He that hath ears to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the church." And so we have to have an ear that is leaning into what the Holy Spirit has to say, because there's a greater glory available for you and I in real time. And we are called to participate and be epistles of something greater and more powerful than what we can look back in history and the catalog and the chronicle of history and read about. And as impressive as all that is, and as wonderful as all that is, you and I are called to something greater. You and I are called to something more. So I want to encourage tonight everybody that's here and you that are listening online. We appreciate it, and sorry about the glitch in the middle, but sometimes things happen. So we bless you and thank you for joining us tonight. We appreciate your tuning in and your patience. So God bless you.